5:30 in the morning, Battle Creek, Michigan. The air smells like toasted wheat and scorched sugar. Rail cars are already lined up along the spur, waiting. Inside the plant, 2,500 workers move through corridors lit by caged bulbs, and the sound is everywhere. Metal on metal, grain falling through chutes like dry rain, steam hissing from pipes that run along the ceiling and vanish into walls so thick the outside world stops existing. This factory held more than $10 million in capital before most American companies had a telephone. $400,000 a year in advertising in an era when a worker took home $2 a day. 65 acres of floor, nearly 2 million square feet. One plant in one small city, pushing close to 300 million pounds of cereal out the door in a single year. Post cereal was on every breakfast table in the country. It survived 2 world wars, the Depression, and the complete reinvention of how Americans eat. The brand outlived its founder by more than a century. The factory still runs today. On paper, this should have been permanent. It wasn't. And the obvious explanations don't apply. No scandal, no failed product, no poison batch, no executive fraud, no single catastrophic decision you can point to and say there, that's where it went wrong. Stand outside that plant this morning. Press your hand against the exterior wall. You can feel it, a low vibration through the concrete. The conveyors are moving. The machines are on. Cereal is being made right now behind this wall at enormous scale. Now turn around. Count the dark storefronts. Count the empty spaces in the parking lot. Count the houses on the next block that are worth less than the cars in their driveways. The machines still run. The city doesn't feel it anymore. How does a company last over a century and still leave its city behind? How does a factory keep producing while a town goes quiet? And how did the founder's own daughter watch the empire she inherited become something she could no longer recognize? The real war was never between cereal brands. It was between a place and a system. And the system doesn't lose. It just stops noticing. This is the story of post-cereal Battle Creek and the woman who held the empire together until holding it was no longer hers to do. If that's the kind of story that makes you think, subscribe now and stay for the whole thing. This one builds. 5:12 in the morning, January, Battle Creek. The temperature is 9 degrees and the sky is still black. A woman walks across a parking lot toward a side entrance, her boots leaving tracks in a thin layer of frost that will be gone by 7. She pulls the door. The seal breaks with a soft pop of pressurized air, and then the sound hits her. A wall of mechanical noise so constant it stops registering after 30 seconds. Conveyors, blowers, the rhythmic thud of boxes being formed and folded, the hiss of steam that smells like cooked grain and something faintly sweet like burned molasses. She has worked this line for 11 years. Her mother worked a different line in a different building on the same property for 22. Her grandfather drove a delivery truck for a cereal company across town that no longer exists. 3 generations, same industry, same city, same smell in their clothes at the end of a shift. But the parking lot is different now. She remembers when her mother complained about fighting for a space. Now she parks in the second row every morning without trying. This city fed America's mornings. And one man, a sick man, a patient who checked into a health sanitarium with no intention of building anything, turned breakfast into an industry that gave Battle Creek its name. His name was C.W. Post. And to understand what happened to this city, you have to start with what happened to him. He arrived in 1891, not as an entrepreneur, not as a visionary, as a patient. Charles William Post had spent years battling chronic fatigue, stomach trouble, and the kind of full-body exhaustion that late 19th century medicine could describe in great detail and treat with almost no success. He had tried doctors. He had tried rest. He had traveled to Battle Creek because of one place and one man. The place was the Battle Creek Sanitarium, The man was Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg ran the sanitarium like a cross between a hospital and a religion. Patients submitted to strict dietary regimens, hydrotherapy, exercise programs, and lectures on the moral dimensions of digestion. Meat was suspect. Coffee was poison. Grain was salvation. The sanitarium wasn't just treating illness, it was converting people to a philosophy of eating, and its primary sacrament was cereal. Post checked in. He followed the program. He ate the food, he drank the grain-based beverages, and he watched. What he saw was not a medical practice. What he saw was demand. Hundreds of patients, many of them wealthy, many of them desperate, had traveled from across the country to eat differently. They weren't just seeking treatment, they were seeking certainty. Someone to tell them, with authority, what to put in their bodies at the start of each day. Kellogg provided that authority. But Kellogg was a physician, not a manufacturer. His operation served patients one at a time, in a sanitarium, at sanitarium prices. Post saw the gap, not between the sick and the well, between the scale of the desire and the scale of the delivery. If people would travel 1,000 miles to eat grain prepared a certain way, what would they do if that grain showed up in a box, on a shelf, in their own town, with the same promise of health printed right on the label? Post left the sanitarium. His health had improved somewhat, though not as completely as he had hoped. That gap between the promise and the result would matter later. But for now, he stayed in Battle Creek and started building. His first product wasn't cereal, it was a hot drink. He called it Postum, a roasted grain beverage positioned as the safe, healthy alternative to coffee. He launched it in 1895, and the pitch was not subtle. Coffee, according to Post's advertising, was a slow-acting poison. It weakened nerves. It damaged hearts. It clouded thinking. Postum, by contrast, was clean, natural, restorative. None of this was supported by clinical evidence. That didn't matter. What mattered was the voice. Post wrote his own ads or directed them so closely that every line carried the same tone. Absolute certainty. No hedging, no qualifiers. Just the calm, firm assurance of a man who had found the answer and was generous enough to share it. Within 2 years, he launched Grape Nuts. By 1904, he introduced Post Toasties, originally named Elijah's Manna, a name so overtly biblical that retailers refused to stock it until he changed it. Each product followed the same logic: a bold health claim, a memorable name, an advertising campaign that treated belief as a raw material, something to be refined and packaged alongside the grain. And somewhere in Battle Creek, a girl was growing up watching all of it. Her name was Marjorie Merriweather Post. She was the founder's daughter. And one day, sooner than anyone expected, all of it would belong to her. But that day was still years away. For now, the factory was growing, the money was extraordinary, and the man who built it was just getting started. The smell came first. Before you saw the factory, before you heard it, you smelled it. Toasted grain carried on steam, pushed out through vents and chimneys and loading dock doors left open in summer. It drifted across the streets of Battle Creek like weather. Residents stopped noticing it the way people who live near the ocean stopped noticing salt. But visitors always remarked on it. The whole city smelled like breakfast. Inside the plant, the air was thicker. Grain dust hung in the mixing rooms like fog that never lifted. Workers tied cloths over their mouths. The ovens ran so hot that crews rotated in and out on short intervals to keep from passing out. On the packaging lines, women folded boxes by hand, thousands per shift, their fingers moving in a rhythm so practiced it looked mechanical, even though the machines that would actually replace them were still decades away. And above all of it, above the steam and the dust and the shift whistles and the rail cars backing in with fresh loads of wheat, the advertising machine ran louder than any piece of equipment on the floor. C.W. Post spent money on print advertising the way railroad companies spent money on steel. It was not optional. It was structural. Without it, nothing else moved. His ads ran in newspapers across the country, full pages that read less like product promotions and more like medical bulletins. Coffee was destroying America's nervous system. Coffee caused heart failure, sluggish blood, weakened willpower. The evidence was never cited because there was no evidence to cite, but the language was specific enough to sound clinical and vague enough to survive scrutiny. One recurring phrase anchored the entire campaign. 3 words, printed beneath the Postum name over and over until they entered the national vocabulary. There's a reason. No footnote, no physician's endorsement, no study reference. Just the phrase, repeated with such frequency and confidence that it began to function as proof of itself. There's a reason. The reason was that Post said so. And Post said so in every newspaper that would take his money, which was all of them. Within roughly a decade, the numbers told the story. The Postum cereal company reportedly held more than $10 million in capital. The advertising budget alone reached about $400,000 a year. In an era when a factory hand earned $2 for a full day's work, Post was spending more on persuasion in a single year than most companies spent on everything. And it was working. Not because Postum tasted better than coffee. By most accounts, it did not. Not because grape nuts cured appendicitis, as some ads implied. It did not. It worked because Post had discovered something that the entire consumer products industry would spend the next century trying to replicate. He had made a belief into a habit. And habits, once formed, don't need proof. They just need a shelf and a spoon. But a habit built on a claim is only as durable as the silence around it. And the silence was about to end. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed in 1906. Enforcement was slow and uneven, but the direction was clear. The era of unchallenged health claims in food advertising was closing. Journalists began asking pointed questions. Competitors, particularly the Kellogg operation across town, bristled at Post's aggressive tactics. Regulatory attention sharpened. Post found himself entangled in legal disputes, including a notable libel fight that forced the company to defend its advertising language in a context where confidence alone was not a sufficient answer. The details of the legal battles are tangled, as these things tend to be when powerful companies and early consumer protection collide. But the pattern was unmistakable. The claims were too large. The promises were too loud. And the world was developing tools to push back. Here is where a lesser story would say the empire crumbled. It didn't. The brand absorbed the hit. The slogan softened by degrees. The most aggressive medical claims quietly disappeared from the copy, but the products kept selling because the habit was already in the muscle memory of millions of American mornings. The boxes were in the pantry. The taste was familiar. The name was trusted not because of what the ad said now, but because of what they had said long enough ago that it felt like something everyone had always known. Post had won the war before the rules changed. The rules changed too late to undo what he had built, but Post himself was coming apart. Through the early 19-teens, his health deteriorated. The chronic conditions that had brought him to Battle Creek in the first place had never fully resolved. He suffered from digestive ailments. His energy failed him in ways that the man who sold vitality to a nation could not reconcile with his own body. Contemporaries described periods of severe depression, a darkness that deepened as his physical condition worsened. His daughter Marjorie was 27 years old in 1914. She had grown up inside the empire. She knew the factory, the products, the rhythms of the business. She had watched her father build something from nothing and sell certainty to a country that was hungry for it. On May 9, 1914, in Santa Barbara, California, C.W. Post died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 59 years old. Stop here. Because this is not a detail to move past. This is the hinge of the entire story. The man who told America that the right breakfast could fix what was broken inside, you could not fix what was broken inside himself. The man who manufactured confidence as an industrial product ran out of it in a room in California, far from the factory floor, far from the smell of toasted grain, far from the empire that bore his name and would continue to bear it long after the name meant nothing personal to anyone. Marjorie received the news, and with it, she received the company. She was not a figurehead. She was not a passive heir. She would prove, over the coming decades, to be one of the most capable and ambitious business figures of her era. But in that moment, in May of 1914, she was a daughter who had lost her father and inherited a machine that could not be allowed to stop. The shift whistle blew the next morning in Battle Creek. The workers came in. The grain poured. The boxes filled. The factory did not pause. Factories never do. That is their greatest strength and their most unsettling quality. They do not grieve. They simply continue. And the people inside them are expected to do the same. Marjorie Post would honor that expectation. She would also, in time, transform the company beyond anything her father had imagined. Whether that transformation was triumph or loss depends on when you stop the clock. The clock, for now, was still running. Marjorie Merriweather Post did not run the company the way her father had. She couldn't. Her father had run it like an extension of his own nervous system, every ad reviewed, every slogan weighted, every decision filtered through one man's conviction about what Americans should believe about their mornings. That kind of leadership doesn't transfer. It dies with the founder and leaves behind a company that has to learn, very quickly, how to operate on something other than one person's instinct. Marjorie understood this, and rather than try to replicate her father's voice, she did something more difficult. She let the company evolve. Through the late 19-teens and into the 20s, the Postum Cereal Company began acquiring, not recklessly, methodically, other food brands, other product lines, other categories that fit the infrastructure Post had already built, the distribution networks, the retail relationships, the factory capacity. The logic was clean. If you already had the trucks and the shelf space and the salesmen, why limit yourself to cereal and a coffee substitute? Marjorie wasn't just approving these moves, she was driving them. She sat on the board. She understood the finances. She had opinions about acquisitions, and she pressed them. In an era when women in American business were largely invisible, she operated with an authority that came not from ideology, but from ownership. She held the stock. She knew the numbers. And she knew that the company her father had built on belief needed a broader foundation if it was going to survive in a world that was getting more complicated and more competitive by the year. By 1929, the company had grown far enough past cereal that the name no longer fit. It reorganized, it reincorporated, and it renamed itself. General Foods Corporation. Say that name slowly and listen to what it tells you. Not Postum, not Post, not a name tied to one product or one founder or one city in Michigan where the air smelled like toasted wheat. General Foods, a name designed to hold everything and belong to nothing. A name built for a portfolio, not a story. Marjorie supported the change. She may have championed it, because she could see what the market was becoming, a landscape where single-product companies got swallowed and diversified companies survived. General Foods would go on to own Maxwell House, Jell-O, Bird's Eye Frozen Foods, Kool-Aid, and dozens of other brands that became staples of the American kitchen. It was one of the most powerful consumer goods companies in the country. And Post Cereal was a piece of it, a profitable piece, a reliable piece, but a piece. This is the moment the story shifts beneath your feet, and it happens so smoothly you almost don't feel it. In Battle Creek, the factory kept running, the mixing rooms still fogged with grain dust, the ovens still threw heat. The packaging lines still hummed, Workers still clocked in before dawn and drove home at 3:30 with that smell in their hair. Nothing about the physical operation changed in any way you could see or touch, but the center of gravity had moved. Decisions about production volumes, about capital investment, about which products justified which level of support, those decisions now flowed through a corporate structure headquartered in New York. The executives making those calls were managing a portfolio. They were balancing Maxwell House margins against Bird's Eye Logistics, against Jell-O marketing spend. Post Cereal was one input in a complex equation, and the factory in Battle Creek was one facility among many. No one in Battle Creek held a meeting about this. No one announced it. The paycheck still cleared. The shift schedule still posted. But the relationship had changed the way a marriage changes when one partner starts making plans without mentioning them to the other. Not hostile, not even deliberate. Just a slow drift toward a distance that becomes normal because no single moment is dramatic enough to confront. Marjorie watched this happen. She had enabled it, in fact, because the alternative was stagnation and decline, and she was too smart for that. But watching your father's company become a division inside a company you helped create is a particular kind of experience. The pride and the loss sit in the same room, and neither one leaves. She stepped back from active management over time. She became one of the wealthiest women in America. She built Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach. She collected art on a scale that rivaled museums. She hosted and donated and traveled in circles that had nothing to do with grain dust and shift whistles. But she kept the stock. For decades, she remained one of the largest individual shareholders in General Foods. The company was in her portfolio the way Post Cereal was in the company's portfolio, a valuable piece of something bigger, maintained at a distance, reviewed periodically, appreciated in the abstract. And in Battle Creek, a worker's daughter grew up and took a job on the same factory floor where her mother had worked. Different line, different building, same property, same smell. She didn't know who Marjorie Merriweather Post was. She knew the brand on the box. She knew the shift times. She knew that her paycheck came from a company called General Foods, and that General Foods was big and far away, and made decisions she would read about in the local paper after they'd already been made. The factory was still the factory. The town was still Cereal City. But the thread between them had stretched thin enough that light passed through it. And then, in a boardroom Marjorie never entered and the Battle Creek worker never saw, someone began assembling the next move. 1985. A conference table in New York. The men around it are not thinking about cereal. They are thinking about cash flow. Philip Morris Companies, the largest tobacco manufacturer in the world, is sitting on a problem shaped like a fortune. Cigarettes generate enormous profits. But the lawsuits are multiplying. The regulations are tightening. The demographic trends are pointing in a direction that no amount of marketing can reverse. Fewer Americans are smoking. More Americans are suing. The cash is real, but the future is narrowing, and the executives in this room understand that a river of money flowing toward a cliff is not a resource. It is a countdown. They need somewhere to put the money. Somewhere stable. Somewhere recession-proof. Somewhere the product moves off shelves every week without anyone having to be convinced, because the habit is already formed. Consumer packaged goods, food. Philip Morris acquires General Foods in 1985 for approximately $5.5 billion. In Battle Creek, the news arrives the way corporate news always arrives in a factory town. Through the newspaper, through a brief announcement from management, through a shift change conversation in the break room where someone says, "You hear who bought us?" And someone else says, "Does it matter?" And the answer, for now, is no. The line still runs. The grain still pours. The boxes still ship. But listen to what just happened. A cereal company born from a health crusade, built by a man who told America that coffee was poison, that grain was medicine, that the right breakfast could restore your nerves and save your life, That company now belongs to the corporation that sells Marlboro cigarettes. No one at the factory gate held up a sign about irony. No one needed to. The irony was structural, built into the transaction itself, visible to anyone who cared to look, and irrelevant to anyone who was paid to look elsewhere. The deal was about cash flow diversification, not symbolism, and cash flow diversification does not pause for irony. 3 years later, Philip Morris bought Kraft. Now one corporate entity owned Marlboro, Maxwell House, Kraft Singles, Oscar Mayer, Jell-O, Velveeta, and Post cereals. The portfolio was so vast that the individual brands inside it became almost abstract. Revenue lines. Cells on a spreadsheet reviewed quarterly by people whose expertise was in capital allocation, not in what happens when wheat hits a hot oven at 4 in the morning. Marjorie Merriweather Post was 12 years dead by the time Philip Morris swallowed her father's company. She died in 1973 at the age of 86, wealthy beyond measure, her name attached to buildings and foundations and art collections that would outlast any cereal box. She had watched General Foods grow into an empire far larger than her father ever imagined. She had watched the company leave Battle Creek in spirit while remaining there in body. But she did not live to see a tobacco conglomerate stamp its name on the lineage. Perhaps that was a mercy, or perhaps she would have understood. She was, after all, a woman who had chosen growth over sentiment, who had traded her father's one-man conviction for a diversified corporation because survival required it. She knew what companies become when they grow up. She had made the first move in that direction herself. But there is a difference between a company growing up and a company being absorbed. Growing up means becoming more capable. Being absorbed means becoming less visible. And Post cereal, inside Philip Morris, inside the Kraft structure that followed, had become so invisible that the only people who remembered it as anything other than a product line were the people in Battle Creek who still made it. The worker's daughter, who had taken a job on the factory floor, was in her 30s now. She had seen the name on her paycheck change. First it said General Foods. Then it said something related to Kraft. The work hadn't changed. The line still ran the same way. The grain still smelled the same. But there was a feeling she couldn't quite articulate, a sense that the building she worked in was connected to its owners the way a rental property is connected to a landlord who lives in another state. Maintained? Yes. Invested in, when necessary? Yes. But not known. Not understood in the way that a place is understood by someone who has walked its floors at 5 in the morning and felt the heat from the ovens and heard the particular sound a conveyor makes when a bearing is about to go. The decisions kept coming from farther away. Production adjustments, staffing targets, capital expenditure approvals that took longer and required more justification. None of it punitive, none of it malicious. Just the natural behavior of a large organism managing a small organ. The organ functions. The organism allocates resources. The distance between them is not cruelty, it is architecture. And then the cereal market itself began to shift, not dramatically, slowly, the way a tide goes out. Americans in the 1990s and 2000s started reaching for something else in the morning. A granola bar eaten in the car, a smoothie from a drive-thru, a yogurt cup at a desk, or nothing at all. Breakfast itself was fragmenting, and the cereal aisle, once the uncontested center of the American morning, began to feel like a place people walked past on their way to somewhere else. The category didn't collapse. It softened. Volume growth flattened. In a corporate world that worships the growth curve, flat is a word that lands on a factory floor like a change in air pressure. You can't see it, but everyone feels it. Inside the Philip Morris empire, now restructuring under the name Altria, the strategic conversation had shifted. The food brands that looked like safe harbors in 1985 were starting to look like weight. Decent margins, but no growth. Reliable revenue, but no excitement. And the new corporate theology demanded focus. Shed what doesn't accelerate. Keep what compounds. The chess pieces were about to move again, and the factory in Battle Creek, still running, still producing, still smelling like toasted grain at 5 in the morning, was sitting on a square that someone in a distant office was studying with a very particular kind of attention, the kind that precedes a sacrifice. 2007. Kraft Foods, which had absorbed General Foods, which had absorbed the Postum Cereal Company, sold its Post Cereals division to Ralcorp Holdings. Ralcorp. Say the name and listen to what it doesn't tell you. It doesn't tell you about breakfast. It doesn't tell you about health or conviction or a founder who believed grain could save a nation. Ralcorp was a private label food manufacturer. Store brands. Generic boxes. The kind of company that makes the product on the shelf below the product you recognize. The kind of company whose entire business model depends on the idea that the name on the box doesn't matter. C.W. Post spent $400,000 a year in early 1900s money to make sure the name on the box was the only thing that mattered. Now his name belonged to a company built on the opposite principle. The factory in Battle Creek didn't close. The lines kept running. Ralcorp maintained the brands, managed the operations, kept cereal moving through the system. From a production standpoint, nothing broke. But something had shifted that no production report could capture. The worker's daughter noticed it in small ways. A maintenance request that took longer to approve. A piece of equipment that got patched instead of replaced. A meeting where a manager used phrases she hadn't heard before, phrases about efficiency targets and margin optimization that sounded reasonable in the room and felt cold on the floor. The cereal was the same. The boxes were the same. But the organism around the factory had changed species again, and this time the new species didn't even pretend to care about the story. General Foods had at least carried the memory of Post in its corporate DNA. Philip Morris had been indifferent, but well-funded. Ralcorp was something new. Ralcorp was a company for which the brand itself was optional. A cost even, a premium you charged consumers for recognition that Ralcorp's core business proved was unnecessary. 5 years later, in 2012, Ralcorp spun off its branded cereal operation into a new, independent, publicly traded company. They called it Post Holdings. Same name as the founder. Brand new entity. No founder's ghost in the hallway, no health crusade, no manifesto about the evils of coffee. Just a lean, acquisition-minded food company with a historic name and a mandate from Wall Street to grow by buying things. Post Holdings went on to do exactly that. It acquired aggressively, moving into protein shakes, egg products, refrigerated side dishes, nut butters. Within a few years, cereal was one piece of a diversified portfolio. The pattern had repeated. Different decade, different owners, same gravitational pull. The product that built the name shrank to a fraction of what the name contained. In Battle Creek, the repetition was felt as a kind of exhaustion. Not crisis. Exhaustion. The factory still ran, but around it, the city was thinning. It happened in layers, the way topsoil erodes. Not a landslide, a slow uncovering. First, the smaller cereal operations. Battle Creek had once hosted more than 80 cereal companies. By the 2000s, that number had collapsed to a handful. The small manufacturers were long gone. The mid-sized ones had been acquired or closed. Even Kellogg, the city's other pillar, was evolving in ways that loosened its connection to the place. Headquarters functions shifted. Decisions centralized elsewhere. The name stayed, but the weight behind it redistributed. Then the adjacent businesses. The suppliers who serviced the factories. The trucking companies that ran cereal routes. The machine shops that fabricated replacement parts for packaging lines. The restaurants that filled up at shift change. Each one was a thread in a web, and as the larger threads thinned, the smaller ones frayed. Then the tax base. Schools felt it first, the way schools always feel it first, because school funding is the canary in every post-industrial coal mine. Road maintenance followed, then parks, then the small invisible pieces of civic infrastructure that no one notices until they degrade, the speed of a permit approval, the condition of a sidewalk, the hours a library stays open. The worker's daughter saw it in the neighborhood around the plant. Houses that her mother's co-workers had bought in the 1970s and 80s, modest places with short commutes to the factory gate, were losing value, not crashing. Softening. The same word the analysts used for the cereal market, a word that means declining slowly enough that no one is obligated to respond. She saw it in the break room, too. The crew was smaller than when she'd started. Not because of a layoff, nothing that clean, that nameable. Attrition. A retirement here, a transfer there, a position eliminated and not refilled. The line ran with fewer people because the machines were better, and the production targets were tighter, and the margin calculations that came down from corporate said this is the head count that makes the numbers work. She didn't argue with the math was probably right, but math doesn't drive past the dark storefronts on its way home. Math doesn't notice that the diner near the East Gate closed, the one where her mother used to stop for coffee after a night shift. Math doesn't register that the elementary school her kids attended consolidated with another school across town because enrollment dropped below the threshold. Battle Creek adapted. Cities do. The Federal Center, a large government office complex, became one of the area's major employers. Healthcare grew. New businesses arrived, smaller, different, enough to prevent the kind of total collapse that makes national news. But the identity question hung in the air like the ghost of grain dust. If the factories that named you are still running, but at a fraction of their peak, if the brands that made you famous belong to holding companies whose investors couldn't find you on a map, if the economy has diversified enough to survive but not enough to thrive, what do you call yourself? Cereal City was a name that used to describe a fact. Now it described a memory. And the distance between those two things was growing wider every year. The worker's daughter transferred to a different section of the plant in 2015. New line, new product. Same building, technically, but a different part of it. A section that had been retrofitted with equipment so modern it looked like it belonged in a different century than the brick walls that housed it. She walked the corridor that connected the old section to the new one. The architecture changed mid-stride. Brick gave way to steel panel. The windows shrank. The ceiling dropped. On one side, she could still see the bones of the original construction, the thick walls and high ceilings built in an era when factory design assumed human bodies would fill every square foot of floor space and needed room to breathe. On the other side, everything was tight, efficient, climate-controlled, designed for machines that didn't need headroom or ventilation or natural light. She passed a display case mounted on the wall near the transition point. Inside it, behind glass, a photograph of C.W. Post, a reproduction of an early Postum advertisement. A grape nuts box from the 1920s, its colors faded, but its lettering still bold. A small placard explained the company's founding. 1895. Battle Creek, a health beverage that launched an empire. She had passed this case hundreds of times. She had never stopped to read it carefully. It was scenery, background, the kind of corporate heritage display that exists in every long-running factory, maintained partly out of respect and partly because heritage photographs well in annual reports and facility tours. But this time she paused. Something about the photograph caught her. Post's expression, the confidence in it, the certainty. This was a man who had looked at a cup of grain water and seen a future so clearly that he bet his health, his money, and his name on it. He had stood in this city, on this ground, and willed something into existence through sheer repetition of belief. She looked at the photograph. Then she looked down the corridor toward her new station, where a computer screen would tell her what the line was doing in real time, and her primary job was to monitor readings and intervene when the numbers drifted outside a tolerance band. The founder had needed 2,500 people to run this plant. The plant now produced more cereal with a fraction of that number. She clocked in and took her position. This is what survival looks like when no one is watching. Not a rescue, not a revival, just a facility that has learned to do more with less, year after year, until the ratio between output and headcount reaches a point that would have been unimaginable to the man in the photograph. The automation didn't arrive as an enemy. It arrived as a series of upgrades, each one individually sensible. A sensor that replaced a manual check, a robotic arm that replaced a repetitive motion, a software system that optimized grain flow and reduced waste by percentages that compounded into millions of pounds over a fiscal year. Each upgrade made the plant more competitive, more efficient, more likely to survive the next round of corporate review when executives in distant offices compared facility performance metrics and decided where to invest and where to cut. The plant survived because it adapted. That is not a tragedy. That is the deal. The deal every factory makes with modernity. You can stay open, but you will stay open with fewer people. You will produce more and employ less. Your output will grow and your parking lot will thin. This is the bargain, and the plant took it because the alternative was not some gentler version of the same future. The alternative was closure, but the bargain has a cost that doesn't show up on a balance sheet. A factory with 2,500 workers is a community institution. It shapes the town's schedule. It fills its diners and shops. It funds its schools through property taxes paid by workers who bought houses nearby. It creates a density of shared experience, the smell, the noise, the shift rhythm that binds people to a place and to each other. A factory with a fraction of that workforce is a production facility. It makes things. It makes them well. It ships them on time, but it does not anchor a community the way it once did. The footprint is the same. 65 acres, nearly 2 million square feet. The building is enormous, but the human presence inside it has contracted until the architecture feels oversized for its contents, like a cathedral built for a congregation that now fills 3 pews. Post Holdings, the corporate entity that owned the operation, was performing well by the metrics that matter on Wall Street. Since the 2012 spin-off, the company had grown through acquisitions. Revenue diversified. The stock told a story of competent management and strategic expansion. Cereal was a stable foundation, and the company was building on top of it with protein brands, egg products, refrigerated foods. None of this was visible from the factory floor. The worker's daughter didn't track Post Holdings' stock price. She didn't read the acquisition announcements. She knew the name on her paycheck. She knew her shift. She knew the sound the line made when it was running right and the different sound it made when something was drifting. She knew that the crew was smaller than last year, and that the year before that it had been smaller than the year before that, and that no one ever called it a layoff because it never was one. It was just a quiet, relentless optimization that shaved one position here and consolidated 2 roles there until the floor felt emptier without anyone ever having been told to leave. She thought about her mother sometimes during the quiet stretches. Her mother had worked a line where you could look left and right and see 30 people doing physical work with their hands, folding and stacking and lifting and checking. Her mother had known every one of them by name. They went to the same church. Their kids played on the same teams. She looked left and right now and saw machines. Good machines. Reliable machines. Machines that didn't call in sick or need health insurance or have opinions about the break room coffee. She didn't resent the machines. That would be like resenting the weather. But she understood something that no efficiency report would ever articulate. The factory was still alive. The thing the factory used to create around itself, the web of lives and routines and relationships that made a building into a place that was harder to find. The machines don't mourn. They were never designed to. Marjorie Merriweather Post was 27 when she inherited the company. She was 86 when she died. In the 59 years between those 2 points, she watched a cereal business become a food conglomerate, a family enterprise become a corporate portfolio, a Battle Creek operation become a line item reviewed in New York boardrooms by men who had never smelled grain dust. She made many of those changes happen. She was not a passenger. She was a driver who understood that the road only went one direction and chose to steer rather than be carried. And she was right. The company survived. The brands endured. The factory kept running. By every metric that business schools teach, she made the correct decisions. But correct decisions, stacked end to end across decades, can carry you to a place that no one would have chosen as a destination. Her father built a company that was inseparable from its city. She built a company that could function anywhere. Her father sold belief. She sold efficiency. Her father's name meant something specific, a man, a product, a conviction about breakfast. By the time the company bearing that name had passed through General Foods, Philip Morris, Kraft, Ralcorp, and emerged as Post Holdings, the name meant nothing specific at all. It was a brand asset, a trademark, a word on a box that tested well in consumer recognition surveys. This is not a judgment of Marjorie. It is a description of a pattern that she happened to be standing inside when it began. The pattern works like this. A founder sees a gap that no one else sees. The gap is never just commercial. It is emotional, cultural, almost spiritual. C.W. Post saw that Americans were desperate for someone to tell them what to eat in the morning with total confidence. He filled that gap with grain and conviction and $400,000 a year in advertising that treated belief as an industrial input. The product mattered, but the belief was the engine. The founder dies or departs. The belief survives for a while on momentum, the way a wheel keeps spinning after the hand that turned it lets go. The company professionalizes. Managers replace the visionary. Process replaces instinct. The belief becomes a brand, which is to say, it becomes a symbol of itself rather than the thing itself. The company consolidates. It acquires or gets acquired. It becomes part of a larger organism that values it for its revenue, not its story. Each acquisition is rational. Each merger makes strategic sense. And each one stretches the distance between the product and its origin by another increment that is too small to protest and too real to ignore. The market shifts, not suddenly, gradually. The category that felt permanent softens. Consumers drift. The product doesn't fail. It just stops being the thing people reach for first. And in a system that measures everything by growth, the absence of growth is a verdict delivered without a trial. The factory adapts. Automation replaces bodies. Output holds steady or increases. Headcount declines. The parking lot thins. The building remains enormous, designed for a workforce that no longer exists, humming with machines that do the work of hundreds without needing a single lunch break or health plan or parking space. The town absorbs it, not all at once, in layers. A supplier closes, a diner shuts, a school consolidates. The tax base narrows. New employers arrive, smaller, different, enough to prevent catastrophe, but not enough to replace what was lost. The identity that was built on the industry outlasts the industry's peak by decades, a name on a sign pointing to a past that everyone remembers and no one can return to. This pattern is not unique to Post. It is not unique to cereal. It is not unique to Battle Creek. It played out in Dayton with cash registers and automotive parts. In Youngstown with steel. In Gary with U.S. Steel. In Flint with General Motors. In Rochester with Kodak. In Pittsburgh before Pittsburgh reinvented itself, and in dozens of smaller cities that are still waiting for their reinvention and may wait a long time. The details are different in every case. The mechanism is the same. An industry builds a place. The place builds an identity around the industry. The industry evolves, consolidates, automates, or shrinks. And the place is left holding an identity shaped like something that no longer exists at the scale that justified it. The worker's daughter in Battle Creek didn't know the history of Youngstown or Gary or Flint. She didn't need to. She knew her own version. She knew what it felt like to drive past the factory where 3 generations of her family had worked and feel simultaneously proud that it was still running and uneasy about what still running had come to mean. Fewer people, more machines, same building, different weight. She had a son in high school. He had never considered working at the plant, not because he looked down on it, because it never occurred to him. The factory was a building he drove past, not a future he imagined. He was going to study something with computers. He was going to move somewhere with more options. He was going to do what the pattern demands of the generation that comes after the generation that held on. He was going to leave, and Battle Creek was going to let him, the way it had let 1,000 like him go before, because a city that lost its center of gravity cannot hold the people who need one. Marjorie Merriweather Post is buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C. The grave is elegant, maintained, appropriate for a woman who was once among the wealthiest people in the country. Fresh flowers appear regularly. The headstone is clean. She is not buried in Battle Creek. Her father is. C.W. Post lies in Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, Michigan, the city where he arrived as a patient and left as an empire builder, the city that smelled like his product for the better part of a century, the city that built its identity on the industry he sparked. His grave is modest compared to his daughter's. The cemetery is quiet. Visitors are rare. Father and daughter separated in death by 500 miles. The distance tells the story better than any corporate timeline. He belonged to Battle Creek. She belonged to the world the company became. And the world the company became had no particular use for Battle Creek beyond what the factory produced. There is a morning, an ordinary one, in the present. The worker's daughter is 53 years old. She has been at the plant for 26 years. She has outlasted 4 corporate owners, 3 line relocations, and more restructurings than she can count without checking her files. Her badge photo taken her first week shows a woman with dark hair and an uncertain smile. The woman who swipes that badge now has gray at her temples and the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what a machine sounds like when it is running right. She parks in the second row. There are spaces in the first row, but she parks in the second out of habit, a habit formed when the first row used to fill. She walks to the entrance, pulls the door, feels the pressure seal break, and the sound hit her, that wall of mechanical hum that swallowed her on her first day and has been the background frequency of her adult life. The line is running, grain is moving. Somewhere in the building, ovens are firing at temperatures precisely controlled by sensors that report to software that adjusts in milliseconds. Boxes are being formed, filled, sealed, and stacked by equipment that operates with a consistency no human crew could match. The cereal that comes off this line today is more uniform, more efficient, more perfect than anything C.W. Post could have produced with 2,500 workers and the full force of his conviction. She monitors her section, checks the readings, notes a slight variance in moisture content, adjusts a setting, watches the numbers settle back into range. This is her skill, the ability to read the line the way a doctor reads a patient, not just the numbers on the screen, but the sound, the vibration, the feel of the floor under her boots when something is slightly off. It is a skill that took years to develop. It is a skill that fewer people possess each year, because each year the machines need less human interpretation and more human monitoring, which is a different thing, a lesser thing, though no one says so directly. Her shift ends at 2. She walks back through the corridor where the architecture changes, past the display case with C.W. Post's photograph and the faded grape nuts box, past the transition from old brick to new steel, past the heritage preserved under glass in a building that has outgrown its own history. She steps outside. The air is cold. It smells faintly of toasted grain, though less than it used to, because the modern ventilation systems capture more of the particulate than the old ones did. Another improvement, another small subtraction from the atmosphere of the place. She drives home through streets she has known her entire life. Past the block where the diner closed, past the school that consolidated, past houses whose values have softened, that word again, the same one the analysts use for the cereal market, as if an entire city's worth of brick and wood and memory could be described by the same term used for a slightly disappointing quarterly report. Her son calls that evening. He is in Grand Rapids, working for a tech company that didn't exist 5 years ago. He sounds good. Busy? He asks how work was. She says fine. He asks if anything is new. She says no. He doesn't ask about the plant specifically because the plant is not a specific thing to him. It is a general fact about his mother's life, like the color of the house or the name of the street. Background, scenery. He will not come back to Battle Creek to work at the factory. She knows this. She has known it since he was 15 and stopped asking what she did at work and started asking what else there was. She doesn't blame him. She raised him to want more, and more is not here. More is in Grand Rapids, or Detroit, or Chicago, or wherever the gravity of opportunity pulls a young person who has options. She hangs up the phone. The house is quiet. Outside, the sky is dark. Somewhere to the east, the plant is running its night shift, a smaller crew than the day shift, monitoring lines that will produce cereal until morning when the next shift arrives and the cycle continues. She thinks about her mother, about the parking lot that used to be full, about the diner that used to be open, about a morning, decades ago, when she was a girl and her mother came home from a night shift, smelling like toasted wheat, and kissed her forehead before she left for school, and the smell stayed in her hair all through first period. That smell, that specific combination of grain and heat and industrial steam that meant her mother was home, and the factory was running, and the city was working, and everything was where it was supposed to be. She can still smell it if she concentrates. Fainter each year. But there. The factory runs tonight. The cereal ships tomorrow. The brand will be on shelves next week in every grocery store in America, and almost no one who drops a box into their cart will think about Battle Creek or CW. Post, or a woman who monitored a line for 26 years, or her mother who folded boxes by hand, or the morning a sick man checked into a sanitarium and saw a future no one else could see. The building remains. The breakfast rushes on. But in a quiet house, in a quiet city, a woman sits with a memory that smells like grain, and she holds it the way you hold something that is still warm but cooling, something you know you cannot keep but are not ready to set down. Not yet.